So we're having these wonderful master classes, and today it's with Michael Shamberg. He's a producer, and he will tell us a lot, I would say, about how to produce films, how he knows what a successful film needs, and how to package a successful film. Maybe he will talk a little bit also about not being so successful with some films, and learning from these experiences, I guess. And we have a couple of clips we would like to show you. It's, I think, not the most obvious films. I mean, I didn't pick Aaron Brockovich, for example. We didn't pick Get Shorty or Pulp Fiction. I think everybody knows these films. We have from your first film, which is called Heartbeat, we will have a look at that one. We will have a look at The Fish Called Wanda, one of his scenes out of A Fish Called Wanda, because I think I have to see it again, this one scene. And we have Gattaca and Man on the Moon, and maybe we have the time to talk even a little bit about Contagion, which is the recent film, and also about Django Unchained, the new production by Quentin Tarantino and you. Okay, Michael Shamberg, maybe you can give us a little bit about your biography, because a lot of, or a couple of the young filmmakers here have asked me, what is this all about, the Rain Dance Corporation and your guerrilla TV book you wrote? Can you fill us in your background?
Well, I'm glad you chose Heartbeat, because it was my first film, and how I put it together and got into the film business is sort of the culmination of where I'd come from before then. And Heartbeat was a dismal flop. And so I was very lucky in that the first film I ever worked on, I produced, and yet it was a terrible flop. And in those days, there was no internet. I remember going to London for some reason and I was walking near the Houses of Parliament, and they had the New York Times newspaper, okay? And I was very excited because they had a review of Heartbeat, and it was a terrible review. And I'll never forget, I think people remember their bad reviews more than their good reviews. Here's briefly my background, how I got into producing, and there's no way to get into producing. You can do it any which way. I was an English major in college. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I actually applied for a job editing film, and they edited on film those days, and the job they offered me was I guess coding edge numbers on takes or something like that, and it seemed so boring I turned it down. And I got very lucky. My first job was as a police reporter in Chicago, working for a local press service. So every night I would go out and cover crime stories. Fires, murders, burglaries, just smaller stuff. And you'd phone these stories in at 5 in the morning. And they didn't care if you didn't get the story. You had only to get the story. So the first job I ever had was you had to succeed in getting the assignment done, regardless of how you're going to do it. And they taught you a lot of tricks about how to talk on the phone and sort of fool people into giving you information. So it was a combination of tenacity, where you couldn't take no for an answer, which is one definition of a producer. And at the same time, I was out on the street every night, and it was very exciting. I parlayed that into a job for Time magazine in New York. And in Time magazine in New York, where I was covering stories, a friend of mine in college was living with a guy, and this was a very important event in my life, who was an artist, and with some other artists, they had obtained the first portable video equipment that had ever come to the United States. Now portable video is your cell phone. In those days, it was a camera about this big and a reel-to-reel half-inch recording deck that was like a briefcase around your shoulder. And I quickly realized as a journalist that you could do documentaries, and you could shoot at about 100 to 1. And in those days, people were doing film documentaries, and film documentaries had its own aesthetic, except for the Maysles brothers, if you know their work, and they were shooting verite. Most film documentaries were much more controlled, and we realized you could just shoot and shoot and shoot. So I wrote a book called Guerrilla Television, which was about the promise of how you could basically make your own television, because in those days there were 3 networks, no cable, and television was a tightly controlled medium, but this ability to make your own television and show it democratized the production of television in a way that hadn't come along before. I failed to realize that you also had to democratize the means of distribution, which is in fact what YouTube has done, and why television is a completely open medium. But I'm 68. When I was a kid, there were 3 networks, and television was something that was very hard to get into, and the idea you could make your own was even harder. So with this portable video, I kind of had this notion that you could do whatever you want, and we would go out and just film people on the street, tape them, and I had the idea that if we went to well-known events in the United States and did them our way, we could put a different perspective on them. And the first thing we did was the national political conventions in 1972. And we had long hair because we were kind of hippies, but everybody would talk to us. We did these amazing documentaries. It was the year that Nixon got nominated and he ran against George McGovern, who lost. And those documentaries got us notice and got us more funding. And then, so we ended up doing the Super Bowl, the American Football Championship. We did the Academy Awards, which I'm still proud of to this day, and I want to produce the Oscars someday and use the same techniques where we would have we had people ride to the Academy Awards with nominees. We were there. We were with people the morning the nominations were announced, and I remember being in Steven Spielberg's office, and with a camera on him, I was doing sound, and he did not get nominated for Jaws, even though the picture did. And he was very gracious, but very humorous. He was kind of like, because he knew how to direct, so the camera's on him. He's really pissed off and disappointed. At the same time, he tried to put on a good face. And so I told Pietro I'd give him a copy of it. And what documentaries taught me was, and they're the best training, because you have to take the footage you have. You don't have the ability to go back and do another take, and we imposed the rule, which was we weren't going to do a narrative voiceover, that is scripted voiceover. We would use voiceover from the actual footage. And so I remember reading a quote from George Lucas once: how do you edit a film? You put all the stuff together that works and figure out what else you need. And that's kind of the way you do a documentary. And editing documentaries is great, because you go, oh my God, why wasn't the camera there? Why didn't you get him walking from here to there? It's very good training for learning narrative filmmaking, interestingly enough. And I realized that it was, in those days, it was pretty much as hard or as easy to raise $5 million for a film as $100,000 for a documentary. And I just had my first children and felt I wanted to expand and to make some more money. And I had an idea for a film. I was driving through San Francisco, and I had an idea I would do a film about the Beat Generation, Neil Cassidy, Jack Kerouac, who are the basis of On the Road, which was just filmed. I didn't know anything about the film business. I just moved to LA, which is where I did the Academy Award documentary, and I was living off credit cards. I had 9 credit cards, and every month I would borrow from one credit card to pay the other credit card. And I borrowed $2,500 from my credit card and optioned a book called Heartbeat, which was about Neil Cassidy, who's the model for Dean Moriarty in On the Road, if you know the movie. And his widow had written a book about her menage a trois with Jack Kerouac and Neil Cassidy. I optioned the book. A friend of mine who I knew through my cameraman from documentary days raised $40,000 from his cousins and his relatives, and we hired a writer-director named John Byram, who's a lovely guy, very good writer, not that good a director, but he knew how to get a movie made. And he wrote this script, and it's one of these great stories where he knew Diane Keaton's sister. Diane Keaton was perfect for the role that Sissy Spacek ended up playing. And he also knew the people at Orion Pictures, and Orion Pictures, formerly United Artists, had done the great films of the time. They did Annie Hall, they did all Woody Allen's films. They won 3 Oscars in a row. And he knew the chairman of the studio, And so now Diane Keaton is interested in the script. It's the year of Annie Hall, and it looks like she's going to win the Academy Award. And the head of Orion Pictures then had given the script to Nick Nolte, who had just come on the scene, first in television with Rich Man, Poor Man, and done a film for them called Who'll Stop the Rain, based on a book called Dog Soldiers. So now we've got Nick Nolte from the studio, John Byram, who would only write it for $40,000, insisting he direct it, and Diane Keaton might be doing it. And they gave us the go-ahead on the film, not wanting to lose Diane Keaton, who then didn't do the film, and we got Sissy Spacek. And every film is like that. It's this game of sort of musical chairs so you get the right elements. So I found myself in the film business literally as a producer on the first film I ever worked on. I was very lucky. But I knew this, and I knew less than anybody on the film, so I would just say, I don't know, tell me what you do. So I kind of used it as a learning experience, and it was very valuable. And several
What was the most important thing you learned?
Well, you never take no for an answer. That's pretty much it. You know, and in general, my general rule is the producer has two jobs. One is to get the movie made, and the other is to get it made well. And they are not the same job on any given day. I can be on the phone all day trying to get money or an actor, and I've always got to keep in my head the vision of what the best version of the film is. And the excitement of that. And I've started every film I've ever made excited about it, thinking it would be a great film, and sometimes I'm right, and sometimes I'm wrong. And and here's the importance of meeting people. There was an established producer named Ed Pressman who put up some money for the development of getting a crew and stuff on Heartbeat. And he was producing Oliver Stone's first film called The Hand. Everybody thinks it's Salvador, but it was actually The Hand, which is horrible. And but I met Oliver. So I've known Oliver for 30 years, and I'll never forget this image, which was Oliver had an office. He had nothing in his office but a desk and a chair, and he was sitting in his office reading a book called How to Direct by John Huston. And that was my introduction to Oliver. At the same time, my oldest friend from college had written the movie Animal House, which was a huge success. And Animal House, if you've seen it, is partly based on things we did in college. And through him, I knew people who were doing what was a brand new wave of comedy in the United States. My friend's name is Harold Ramis. He did Ghostbusters. He did Stripes. He did some of the best comedies. And he also then rewrote and directed Groundhog Day, which is a great comedy. And through Harold, I knew all the people doing this new comedy, and my partner from the movie Heartbeat and another guy who Harold introduced me, we got a deal at a studio to do kind of youth-oriented comedies from a great studio head, Alan Ladd, who had made his reputation by doing Star Wars. And so this whole group of people with whom I came into the film business, the executives, some of them then went on to run studios. It's a business of relationships, and the way I got, and you just want to gravitate towards, people who you think are good and talented and you enjoy hanging out with. You just want to stay in touch, because what the film business needs, and I'm speaking about the American film business, but I'm sure it pertains everywhere, they don't need you to come and pitch a movie for Steven Spielberg. He's got enough movies to choose from. But they need the next Steven Spielberg, okay? They need the next Ridley Scott. They need you to find those new filmmakers who are going to come into the mainstream of Hollywood and make great films. So the people with whom you come into the business and who you know, you will move up with them. And look at Scorsese's career and how many films he's done with De Niro. Mean Streets, I think, was his second film. So that's just one of the things you notice. And I've had what I call pretty much good taste and good luck, because the way I produced The Big Chill, which was my first success, was nominated for an Academy Award, was the writer-director Larry Kasdan was across the hall from me when I had my first office, and he was writing it, and he asked me to produce it because we were talking about the script as he was developing it. And the way I was asked to produce The Fish Called Wanda was my ex-wife's sister-in-law was the roommate of a woman who John Cleese was going to marry.
We talk about this later.
Okay?
Stick to Heartbeat.
and because I had worked with Kevin Kline, John Cleese had written the part in A Fish Called Wanda for Kevin, for which he won the Oscar. And that's why, because he knew I knew Kevin, and he'd always wanted to do it with
So it's all about relationships and knowing people and meeting people and
Yeah, it is when you're first starting out. But it's
You were
also,
26 when you did
no,
produce
no, I'm older.
or 25
no, I didn't,
when you
I didn't get
produced
into the
your
film business till I was 35.
30.
So also, the other thing was I had life experience, and I don't think you need to go to film school. I think you need to see a lot of films, okay? Because one of the things is when you meet people who want to be filmmakers and haven't seen films, you just can't take them seriously. And it's like Quentin Tarantino, I've been lucky to work with twice. You know, he never went to college. He worked in a video store and saw every film. You must see as many films as you can. If I'm with a writer or director and they've never seen a Billy Wilder film, I just think they're hopeless, okay? And you just have to see all those films because you assimilate the vocabulary of them, one, two. But I know that I can discuss with any good writer, director, editor, a favorite film of theirs that I've seen and use that as a common aesthetic. It's as if, you know, it's if you're a painter and you don't know Picasso or Matisse or all the great painters, no, you know, you don't have to paint that way, but you need to be part of that history. So you must be, I mean, Soderbergh says he watches a movie a day, and I think Quentin watches like 3 movies a day some days, okay? That you've got to do that because there's a writer in America named Malcolm Gladwell who's very well known. He observes social patterns and writes books about them, and he came up with what he calls the 10,000 hour rule. It takes at least 10,000 hours to become good at something reflectively and instinctively. So yes, I was lucky to meet all these people, but I'd grown up watching films. I'd loved films, and I'd seen the films, and it became a common vocabulary, and you could work out from that to a personal relationship. So it's not just enough to know people and suck up to them. It's enough, you need to have something to say. And then within that, if somebody has an idea, the producer's sort of the engine of getting that going. So, and I just sort of just kept going after that. Everyone has a favorite film. Mine is Lawrence of Arabia, which I saw like 10 times when it came out, and I can still watch. And I realized that film is about the romance of filmmaking. When I see that film, it's not that I want to be Lawrence, and I was later lucky enough to work with Peter O'Toole. It's that it's for me, such a captivating film on every level that it just became a romantic thing to be able to make films and express yourself like that. And that's probably my touchstone and why I keep coming back to it. And there are just days there are days when you're doing nothing but making phone calls and raising money and talking to agents, and the process is deadening, but you always come back to just the thrill of making a film.
I found a very old interview with Nick Nolte at about the time when this film was published, and he talked about that Allen Ginsberg, one of the Beats, was not very pleased because he was sort of portrayed in the film. And
well, I remember.
Did you have, as a producer, problems with?
Well, there are various laws on how you can and can't portray people, but the short of it is if they're public figures, you can do them as long as you don't ask their permission and they say no. So what you tend to do then is just do them, because if they're going to say no, then it's precluded legally from using them. I remember meeting Ginsberg at the time, and I don't think he was particularly happy about it, but I also remember meeting Ken Kesey, who'd written One and Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which won an Oscar, and because Neil Cassidy, Nick's character, he drove the bus for the electric Kool-Aid acid test, and Kesey was on another plane like he was always on acid. Everything was very meta to him. He was always looking at patterns, and I said, I'm really different from all the people in Hollywood. I want to do really good work. And he basically said, there's 2 schools in Hollywood. There's the people who want to be part of Hollywood and think they're part of Hollywood, and then there are people like you who think they're not part of Hollywood, but they are anyway. So at that point, I dropped any pretense that I was working outside the system.
Michael, you said that this film wasn't very successful. How did you deal with that?
I was depressed. You're always depressed when your film's a flop. I guarantee you, to this day, when Steven Spielberg has a flop, he's as depressed as a first-time filmmaker. You put so much into it, and when you preview a film, even though you're not in it as an actor, you feel like you're standing up there asking them to like you, and it's just depressing. Now, the only thing is I've gotten older, and I can deal with this. I can deal with the disappointment better. I know it's not my whole life and my career's not over, but I'm always going to be depressed if a film's a flop.
And what were your thoughts about going to the next project? What did you change, or what?
You know, my next film was a film called Modern Problems, a comedy with Chevy Chase, which was actually a commercial success. Both. I have a long time and wonderful partner, a woman named Stacy Scher, and our curse and our blessing is this: we don't specialize in any genre. If I was Jerry Bruckheimer, who's a great producer, I'd be doing a certain type of film. Okay, some producers specialize. We've done everything. If you look at my work, and so we just sort of keep going. And the curse of it is we've only done one sequel in my entire career, which was Be Cool, a sequel to Get Shorty, and the sequel is moderately successful. And the blessing is that everything's a new adventure. So it's stimulating to work on different types of material.
Going into comedies, I mean, it's
Yeah.
a completely different genre, and we're heading towards A Fish Called Wanda now. You already gave us some information on how you got in contact with John Cleese. Tell us about how this Brit comedy with the Monty Python crew sort of took place. And
Well, I remember seeing Monty Python when their first film, and now for something completely different, was released, and I was just lucky enough to meet John, who's just brilliant, and he'd pretty much written the script, okay, and the conceit of it was the Americans versus the Brits, which is sort of the dramatic heart of the film, and I was talking about Dr. Strangelove the other night with Daniel, and which is a perfect film. I don't think Wanda is a great film like that, but it's a perfect film because everything must work. And it's built like a Swiss watch, that film. Everything leads to everything else. It's probably my most perfect film in that sense, because it's almost flawless. Interestingly enough, I can tell you two things. You asked what the producer does. What the producer does is that if you've seen the film, there are these three wonderful moments where these dogs are killed. And the dogs are all artificial. I actually have them in a coffee table in my office. And Charlie Crichton, the great director who'd done The Lavender Hill Mob, who John Cleese had made a lot of money in a company that did industrial training videos, and Charlie had sort of fallen by the wayside and was directing them, and he wanted to give Charlie one last hurrah, which is how he came to direct it, and he got an Oscar nomination for it. And he talked about knowing where to put the camera. There are certain directors who, Eastwood's good at it too, and if you watch a Sidney Lumet film, you know, one shot will resolve into another. Either the camera will go wide or slightly move, and something else will happen in the shot. And the camera's not being moved for its own sake; it's being moved for dramatic purpose. Well, Charlie knew where to put the camera for comedy. But I remember this: the first dog that's killed, I can't remember. I think it's run over by a car, and we have this little stuffed dog that's got a tire mark in it, and Charlie decides he needs a lot of blood. Okay. And he's sprinkling blood all around, and you know instinctively there's a certain line where it's not going to be funny, okay? And so my contribution was telling him there's too much blood, okay? So we did two takes, one with blood and one without, and the one without it is in it. I remember that, and I remember the ending, because endings are hard. We shot the ending 3 times, and finally, in the original ending, John Cleese gets on the airplane with Jamie Lee Curtis, and there's a bag with the money, the diamonds, and they look at each other, glare at each other, and they both put their hands on the diamonds because they don't trust them. And I make a habit of watching dailies because I hate to leave a location not having coverage you need, or you go back and reshoot. If you can reshoot while you're in production, it's the best thing you can do.
And cheaper, I guess.
Yeah, and then the editor will tell you what you need. It's more expensive to do it later. I'll make an exception to that. And we shot it again where it was warmer, but finally we had to go back and shoot it a 3rd time. And there was a lesson that came up on both films. But the woman I'm married to now is just a friend then, and she was to dinner with us and John, and she had this observation, and Steve Martin was there too, that people wanted to see Kevin Kline's character one more time. And what happens is at the end of the film, we didn't shoot him, but you hear him like he's on the wing of the airplane. Somehow he's survived, and he's going, "Get your hands off of her," or something, and then he falls off the plane. And what I realized in comedy is if you have big laughs, you can't top them at the end, but what you can do is remind people how much they like the film by giving them one more laugh. And the great thing about Wanda is there's a big farce scene, and I think the first dog or the scene in the house, I can't remember. It's a 100-minute film, and it comes halfway through. Now, most contemporary films will save the big thing. We had a big farce scene in the middle, and we kept topping it, which is why the film, I think, is so successful. And on Aaron Brockovich, we previewed it, and it was one of the best testing films we'd ever had. And Pietro was talking about studio executives, and studio executives are good for knowing where there's a problem. They're terrible at suggesting how to fix it, because they can only suggest how to fix it in a way they've seen work in another film. And you don't want that. So the head of the studio said at the end of Aaron Brockovich, well, you know what it really needs is it needs a courtroom scene where judge can say you've won and everybody cheers. And we all thought that was too cliched. And Soderbergh realized that what they really wanted was another scene of Julia Roberts and Albert Finney. And the ending, the penultimate scene in the film originally ended on Julia knocking on doors that Aaron Brockovich is still out there. But the penultimate scene now is that Albert Finney gives her a check, and she's sure he's cheated her, and she starts yelling at him, and the check is like for $1 million or $2 million, and she finally is flabbergasted for one time. So here again, it was the instinct that people wanted the character once again. They wanted to be reminded about how much they like the film. It's a very successful conclusion, and as a corollary of that, because working with Albert Finney was a great treat, and acting is reacting. The great actors can react, and all Albert does is listen to her in the scene, and with just the slightest eye movement, and his face is just genius. So you learn from your own films. You learn what works, and you sort of get this knowledge base of what works. And what struck me in Pietro's lecture was, more than any editor I've ever heard, he comes with this incredible toolkit. He's talking about the dialogue, the sound design. One of the great score things in Gladiator was Lisa Gerrard from Dead Can't Dance doing this wonderful kind of vocal, and he brought that toolkit to it. Okay, and what you have as a producer is a toolkit. You have this toolkit, and now my job isn't 100% creative like his job. My job is the toolkit that helps get the movie made. Okay, my job is knowing, when to push somebody and when to lay back, and getting back to shooting a film. There's a great moment in Out of Sight. The film starts, if you've seen the film, and Soderbergh considers his least flawed film. And George Clooney and Jennifer Lopez meet because they're trapped in the trunk of a car. And Steven had this very audacious idea that he would do it in one take, okay? And so it's just them and their heads together, and it's a very long scene, and none of us thought it would work. But we knew it was the cheapest scene to reshoot because it was just two actors in a set that was the size of this thing, the trunk of a car. So you make the decision rather than argue with the director and say to him, look, we can't get this set back. Sure, try it. And it didn't work. And we previewed the film the first time. And it starts the film. It was the least liked scene in the film. And when we shot the new scene where he basically did coverage, okay, from close-ups, it became the favorite scene in the film. So by that time, I had enough decision to know you have to respect the director. You can't say to him your idea stinks. You have to let him fail, okay? And good directors know they failed, and then they'll come back and correct it. And because I remember in the last film we did, Steven was having with one of the studio executives. They had a disagreement on a point, and Steven said to the executive, who's the go-between, tell your boss just because he disagrees with me doesn't mean I'm wrong. And so I sort of like to let the director, the way I keep them out of trouble is giving them the option. If what they doesn't work, they need another thing. I would never tell a director not to try anything, because they're the director, and it's not just they're the director. It's if you choose a director you want to work with, they're going to come to the table with ideas you simply haven't thought of. So you get to the point where you sort of learn the social skills. I mean, you could get a degree in psychology and be a producer as easily and know as much as a degree in film.
Let's get back to A Fish Called Wanda.
Yeah.
When you read the script and when you, after all, saw the rushes, or What was your idea of that film? I mean, it's a lot of black humor in that film. I mean, it's like cutting the edge, as you said, with the blood. You had to be very precise on how much.
There's another great scene, and on the page it was, and this is something else. The funniest scene in the script was not in the film. It was truncated in the film. And the funniest scene is, if you've seen the film, it's Michael Palin stutters, and he has to tell John Cleese the name of the hotel where the jewels are, okay? And because he stutters, and Cleese does it in the script, it's this. It makes me laugh to think it. First, he gives him a pencil. The pencil breaks, okay? Then I can't remember what's in between, but then he's desperate. Oh, then it's a typewriter, and the only paper they can find, I think, is toilet paper. So he can't type on that, okay? And it's getting more and more absurd. And then he finds a pencil, okay? And the pencil point breaks, okay? And the only thing he can find to sharpen the pencil with, I think, was an electric carving knife, okay? And Michael Palin takes the electric carving knife and cuts himself and bleeds profusely and ultimately just writes it in blood, okay? And I can't remember how much of it's in the finished film. On the page, it was hilarious. And it just didn't work, okay? It probably didn't work because the velocity of the film at that point, you couldn't do a far sequence that was building so slowly. And you can extrapolate from that. In the movie Contagion, when we set out to do it, Soderbergh was a little worried because by contract he had to deliver a film for 2 hours or less, and he thought that it was going to, because there's so many storylines, he thought he could only do it in 2:15 because Traffic had multi-storylines. The conception that Traffic would be like Contagion was completely wrong. And Steven is a very brave director. He shows his rough cut. He has a rough cut probably 3 days after he's wrapped, and he invites his friends to watch it, okay? And he will just take the slings and arrows of it because the film's not working. He's very brave that way. And at 2 hours and 10 minutes, I was like, Coppola has a saying attributed to him, a film's never as good as the dailies and never as bad as the rough cut. I love the dailies. I don't want to blow my brains out on the rough cut every time. I thought Aaron Brockovich was going to be a disaster. I thought Get Shorty was going to be a disaster, okay? And so Contagion, it just wasn't working. It wasn't working. And finally, we had a very good writer friend of ours look at it and be very stern with him. I'll never forget, it was at the other producer's house, and it was Steven, me, and my two producing partners and the writer, and he just said, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. And Steven had figured it out. He'd figured out the George Lucas dictum, take out everything that doesn't work. And he just took everything out, and in 100 minutes the film works. And he said, it's an urgent situation, you can't take your time. So, and this is something Pietro talked about, which is the film in the editing room, that's the film you've got, okay? And there's another truism about, and this is partly learned through experience, when you edit a script, you think you've taken out all the redundancy. You think you go, okay, well, this scene is telling the audience exactly what they already know, both either expositionally or emotionally. Let's take it out. And you start to cut a script. And then when you get the rough cut, you realize you've done the same scene over and over. And one of the frustrations we've had as a jury is a lot of films we're seeing now are shot digitally, and they're shot with naturalistic performances and handheld. And we've seen an enormous amount of films where you're seeing the same film over and over again. Because I think the director likes the performance, and they go, well, this scene's good and that scene's film. And these films are robbed of a certain velocity. And part of what you get from experience is, okay, we've got to move on. We've got to move more quickly. And then you can't have somebody come in a room and talk. You've got to find a way to do it. Although there's a story I've heard that Roger Corman, the great indie producer, supposedly, it's probably true, in those days there were no cell phones, and he would always have a phone booth on the prop truck, because if he was running into trouble, either he didn't have time or money to finish a scene, or he needed something, somebody would go into the phone booth and have a phone call and explain what was supposed to happen. And your experience base gives you all these sort of tricks creatively, but my job is to get a good film. And a few years ago, there was a really lovely woman, she'd come from television to be head of one of the studios. And in television, nobody cares about the director. They do more and more, but it's essentially a writer's medium, and the studio can dictate how a film is directed in television, particularly episodic television. She said, why does everybody listen to the director? she couldn't understand it. Why don't you just tell the director what to do? But in film, the organizing principle for information is it flows through the director. It's just like, why did anybody listen to George Bush? Because he was the president. And you read about any president, this one's trying to manipulate him, that one's trying to manipulate him, and everybody's in orbit around the director. And if you do a movie where the director's a moron and can't express themselves, you have to compensate for that, but you can't replace it. Now, so everything flows through the director, and your job as a producer is to choose the right director, somebody you respect, and somebody whose vision you can support. Now, having said that, there's directors who bring so much to the table, okay? Some days there's nothing for you to say because as a producer, if a shoot's going well, and we go to the shoots because that's where you make a good film, we go every day, there's nothing for you to do. But then you can fill in. Did you miss this? Did you see that? There was this shot on Aaron Brockovich. I kept telling Soderbergh, you need this one shot. It was a reaction shot. And I said, I have to go out of town the day you're shooting it. Please get it. And he said, I think I got it. And he didn't get it. We went back and reshot it. So you can add to the director's vision, and a great director brings pretty much everything you need, and then you want to up your game, because there are people who want to make you do your best because they're bringing their best, and other people need more help. The writer-director, particularly the first-time writer-director, all they do is guard their words. Every line of dialogue pretty much has to be played straight to camera. They don't want to do throwaway dialogue. They don't want to move the camera in a way that tells the story. They just want to hear their dialogue. And you sort of have to nudge them, respecting their strengths. But the great directors, they come with a visual. Like, one of the great things about Tarantino is that Quentin, Fitzgerald had a dictum that character is action, and for Quentin, dialogue is action. Quentin does this thing where people talk and the tension builds and the tension builds. There's no better example of that than the first scene in Inglourious Bastards, where Christoph Waltz is talking about Jews and the girls under the floorboards, and he does that in Django, and it's talk first, shoot later, because then people start shooting each other. But you can take Quentin's dialogue out of his action films, and you don't need it's amazing. There's this scene in Django. It's in the trailer, so I'm not giving everything away. And I'm the executive producer. My partner is the producer, so I haven't been involved in the day-to-day. And it's Christoph Waltz comes into town. He's a bounty hunter, and he shoots the sheriff. And everybody in town is like amazed. But you learn that the sheriff is a wanted man proposing as a sheriff. And all the townspeople run away except for one woman who faints, okay? And so the camera goes high, and now on the street you've got Christoph Waltz who shot him, you've got the dead guy and the fainted woman, and there's something about it's just people start laughing. And it's not unreal. He just has this genius of knowing what to do with the camera. So the great ones know how to tell a story. I've told this. Soderbergh has a rule which is he hates directors who don't know where to put the camera, and I hate camera movements for its own sake, but I'm the producer, so I can't go up there and say, hey, you can't do that. I simply have to make a suggestion, and I have to let people fail, because the good directors will be right more than I'm right. And I think experience has sort of given me the confidence to do that. The funny thing was, the biggest problem was the chips kept falling out of his nose. It was harder to keep them in, and the fish were gelatin fish, so they weren't real fish. Yeah. But I learned something from that, too. It's a scene that people have a hard time watching, and if somebody tells you there's a movie and there's a scene you have a hard time watching, you'll want to see that movie.
Yeah, you had like the test screening wasn't very, I mean, that was a difficult scene, right?
Well, yeah. Also, the great thing was we tested the movie and it scored an 80, which is a system they have in the top two boxes. And then the studio decided, I think rightly, the ending didn't work. And then we reshot the ending in the way I told you, and it tested again at 80. It was exactly the same score. But then when it was in the theaters, it tested at like almost 100, because when people paid to see a film and they like it, it's that much more popular for them.
Michael, let's talk about choosing directors as a producer, working with directors. What are your criterias, or how do you decide, okay, I trust a person?
Well, we like new directors, as you'll see when you see Gattaca, because part of the fun of it, we did Ben Stiller's directorial debut, Andrew Nichols' directorial debut. We've done the second film of People, John Hamburg, who directed Along Came Polly, and Quentin's second film was Pulp Fiction. It's a passion for film and a nose for material, and then you hope that they kind of know what they're doing. So I think the larger thing is why first and second time directors, because that's part of the fun of why you get into the film business. And also, you can't really get Steven Spielberg to direct your film. I'd love to work with Ridley Scott. I probably will never, because he does his own material. And the first instinct of everybody is, well, let's get Ridley, let's get this one, and you don't get them, so you need new directors. So you either go to an established director, or you're looking for somebody who might be kind of new and exciting. So it's a good business strategy to develop them, and it's also a fun creative strategy.
With Gattaca, I mean, it was a director, it was a debut director, Andrew Niccol.
Yeah, Andrew Niccol.
But he already wrote a script.
Andrew Niccol had written The Truman Show, and he wrote it on the condition that he could direct it, and the studio bought it on the condition that he would be allowed to direct a test scene if they didn't like it. So he ended up not directing it, although Peter Weir did and did a really good job. But Andrew, on his second film, was determined that he not be bumped off as a director. And because we had a reputation for protecting directors, that's how we came to do it. And I actually consider it still his best film, because the script is a tight script. And he's a very visual director, sometimes at the expense of storytelling. It's a very visual film. So I'm very proud of the film.
How was the packaging for Gattaca? I mean, it's Uma Thurman, Ethan Hawke working.
I'm trying to remember how it came together. I think it was we knew Jude from reality. We knew rather Ethan from Reality Bites and is perfect. And then our casting director found Jude Law. It's Jude's first American film, which I'm also proud of. As Reality Bites, you're talking about new talent. Reality Bites was Emmanuel Lubezki, the great cinematographer's first American film. And it's very exciting to take these first-timers and have them do an American film. And then I can't remember who suggested Uma, but that's sort of how it came together.
Was it difficult to finance?
No, it wasn't. Because I've not talked as much about the business side of it, which is part of what I do as a producer, more so than the other people. I did a presentation to the Producers Guild, and I went back to and it was a good panel. It was myself, it was my friend Mark Johnson, who produced the Diner, won an Oscar for Rain Man, Doug Wick, who won the Oscar for Gladiator, Mike DeLuca, who did Moneyball and Social Network, and Sian Chafin, who produces David Fincher's films. And I did a presentation from the year I got into the film business, which is about 1980, my first film, to now. When I got into the film business, 84% of the films, the top box office films, were American-made, 16% were foreign. The ratio is now 69% foreign box office, okay, and 31%, meaning the global box office is now basically 2-to-1 foreign. And that dictates the types of films that are being made. You ask why the Avengers and I like the Avengers, all those films are being made because they can travel. If you blow a lot of shit up, people can watch it around the world. If your film is culturally specific, it doesn't travel. Like American comedies, with few exceptions, don't travel as well. And the flip side of that is all the major studios now have divisions for local productions, because you can gross $50 million in a local market on a much reduced budget because films are less expensive. So the whole financing dynamic of the film business has changed since I got into it. And what has also changed is that the studios have these big distribution machines. They can do anywhere from 15, 18 films a year. And when I started out, certain films they'd fully finance, okay? Like Heartbeat would be fully financed. If I made Heartbeat today, the way I'd get it financed is I'd get an actor and a director, or both, who means enough in the foreign marketplace that I could get pre-sales to cover, say, 80% of the budget, okay? The studio would still distribute the film, but what they won't do is write you one check for it. Their resources are limited, and so they still need the type of film we do, but they don't finance them or fully finance them anymore because they're only financing these big films. And when you put $150 or $200 million into a film and another $100 million in to market it, and $1 billion doesn't go that far, okay? So now they need producers like us to scramble. So we've had to sort of change our game, and one of the things I come to the festivals for is you meet the foreign financiers here as well. That's the big shift. Where the next film I'm doing with a very good writer-director named Scott Frank, there's a series of mystery novels by a well-known writer in the States named Lawrence Block, and the film we're doing is called A Walk Among the Tombstones. And Scott wrote the script 13 years ago, but it's not dated. And we've been through 3 actors and 4 directors, and now we're doing it with Liam Neeson, okay? And the formula is a company called Cross Street, which is the Black Swan. They've pre-sold foreign for about 80% of the budget, and they're putting up the other 20% of the budget. Universal is distributing it. So that's my job now, is getting the financing. And if you do foreign pre-sales, what's problematic about it is they want actors who may not be right for the part, but they can get you the financing. They want a director like, on one film I have, they suggested a director who's 180 degrees wrong for the film, but he can get financing. So it gets back to you have to get the movie made and get the movie made well. So in the old days, you had to get the actors because they wanted the actors, like Aaron Brockovich got made because we got Julia Roberts. Now it's a combination of actors and directors, and with respect to selecting the director, it's just you have to have an enormous amount of belief in the director and fight for them.
Michael, maybe that's the moment now for questions from all these films, young filmmakers. On the director's side, maybe you have some specific questions for Michael Shamberg.
On any side, because I should be, if you want all of you here to be producers, it's how do you assemble the film, on every level. It's how do you get the script, how do you get the financing, how do you get the cast. If there's any questions, if not, I'm happy to keep talking. Yes.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you.
There's something that I wanted to ask you because some years ago, studios and especially the American market was making films for really high budgets. And I was at the forum and they were discussing about films now. Producers are making, they can make kind of a studio type of film, but much lower budget. And has the recession had any kind of contribution towards it? And how does it affect getting talent from casting?
Well, that's a good question. Okay, here it gets back to what I said. They still want movies that cost $25 or $30 million for their pipelines. And those movies can still be big hits, but they're not fully financing for the reasons that I say. Now, how does the recession factor in? The recession factors in is that they have less access to credit, they have higher risk, so the money has to be pieced together more. And the lower budget films, it's probably a more vibrant marketplace now for lower budget films. It's a much better time to be assembling them. And here's the thing. Actors like to work, they like good roles, okay? When you see these films that are lower budget films that have big stars in them, they're not getting their full quote, okay? You have an actor who gets $5-10 million, he will do these smaller films for the joy of working with the filmmaker and because they like the role. So it's not that hard to get them if you have a good script. And another kind of saying I have is this. If you gave me 2 suitcases and one of them had $500 million in financing or $300 million and the other one had 5 good scripts, give me the 5 good scripts. I can always get the money. A good script is like gold. You can never go wrong because you can put it together. And also, you find sometimes that if you need to get to an actor to put your movie together and you're not yet making the film, it's hard to get them to read it. The moment a movie is going, you have 2 advantages. You can actually offer them real money for it, or now they're afraid somebody else will get the part. They'll go, oh, they're making that movie, well, I better read it because I don't want somebody else to get the part. So that you have to relentlessly create this sort of momentum and just act as if your movie is going. And it's a lower budget. I think it's very vibrant. Now, I've been lucky enough to work with directors. The way we got Contagion made was that of the 7 people, including the 6 stars, everyone had either won an Oscar, okay, or had been nominated. Soderbergh, Marion Cotillard, Gwyneth, Kate Winslet, Matt Damon won an Oscar for writing, okay? We had like 6 Oscar winners. And now Contagion's a good film because nobody works more than 2 to 3 weeks because they're not in the same scenes together. But when Steven Soderbergh calls you, people will do this film because it's Steven Soderbergh, okay? So if there's certain directors like Soderbergh or Oliver, because Nick Cage agreed overnight to be in it, or everybody will do a Spielberg film, it makes your life easier. So there are a lot of ways into actors. Having the right director is one, and having a great script is one. But sometimes you have to keep trying. There was one actor we tried to get for World Trade Center, and we sent him the script 5 times, and I don't know if he read it. Or the joke is that his agent called and he read the script and likes it, and we had to tell him he'd already made the movie. So, and you just learn all this. You need to know a lot of agents and managers in the film business because there are a lot of filters. And the best thing is to be able to call people directly, okay? And the trick there is if I go straight to a director or an actor, I will then always call the agent and say I've done it, but won't go through the agent. But I don't want to embarrass the agent. And I have this technique, which is every time I hang out with an actor or a director, I say, give me your email address. So, now I did a film and I become friendly with Ben Affleck, and I've got his email address, okay? And so I'm always trying to accumulate, and particularly now because of email, I can get in touch with everybody. And my big fear is, here's a small technique, is my fear is I'm going to lose my BlackBerry and those names again. I lost my BlackBerry in Paris 2 years ago, and since then I put a password on it. But every Monday, I have my assistant back up my BlackBerry because during the week, and every Friday I do it. Mondays for the names I get on the weekend, and Fridays for the names I get during the week, because now I can get directly to these guys, okay? And so I'm always, the value I have is it's easier for me to get people as established producer because I either know them or I know their agents. But you just have to be relentless. There's one of my role models as a producer, there are 3 producers who've won Academy Awards for 3 Academy Awards. I think Zanuck has won 3, Saul Zaentz won 3, and Sam Spiegel. Sam Spiegel was a 50-year-old immigrated to America, and he didn't make his first film till he was 50 years old. He was kind of a publicist and sort of a fixer, very charming guy. And one day he's walking across the lobby of the Beverly Hills Hotel, and he runs to Elia Kazan. And what are you doing here? Well, I'm trying to get this movie made. Nobody will finance it. Here's the script. The script was for On the Waterfront. Sam Spiegel got it made and won the Oscar, and then he won 2 more Oscars with David Lean, one for Bridge on the River Kwai, one for Lawrence of Arabia. So, but he knew Elia Kazan, and Elia Kazan's telling him his woes, and you create opportunity out of that, You just have to take the smallest kernel of opportunity and try and turn it into something, and never give up.
Never give up.
Hi. Some of your films are among my favorite films.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and I grew up with those films in the 90s. And for example, Gattaca, and I was wondering if you have the feeling that in the Hollywood system that changed something within, I think, that the last 10 years, because we were talking already about changes in the financial structure.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I missed something which I had in the films in the 90s,
yeah.
a hard thing, and I was wondering if you have the same feeling and if you have an explanation why.
Well, I think I've pretty much given the explanation, which is studios are financing the big films. The films you need to get financed through the foreign sales marketplace tend to be less personal films for the most part. It's harder to make the sort of more personal, expressive film now, although you can. Now, some people get a pass, like Terry Malick, and here's why, okay? And I really like Tree of Life, and I wasn't expecting to, but he got Brad Pitt and Sean Penn, because it's why Woody Allen, arguably one of the greatest American directors, but very hit or miss, okay? But he's like Eastwood. He needs to. I don't think he can live unless he wakes up and makes a movie every day. And God bless him. At his age, I hope to be doing the same. But if Woody Allen calls you, you go make a Woody Allen film. And some of his films are just bad, okay? So the personal filmmakers who can call people up are fewer and far between, who get the stars, who get them the financing. Now, the new filmmakers, it's a little bit trickier. So you scale down on your budgets, like the film, I can't remember what it's called. It was called The Surrogate. It played here. It's the one with Bill Macy and Helen Hunt and John Hawkes, and he's a quadriplegic, and she's a sex surrogate. It's supposed to be
The Sessions.
The Sessions, okay. The producer, I know him, he said it cost $1 million, okay. So the budgets are scaling down on those. Now here's where it gets interesting for me, which is I see these first-time filmmakers who I love, and I ask them one question: do you want to make a Hollywood film someday? Do you want to make Hollywood films? And there was a really fine American director whose work you may or may not know named Hal Hartley, who continues to make independent films. And years ago I said, you want to make Hollywood films? And he said no, okay? So I'm not interested in him. I'm interested in his work. So the question is, these smaller films, what do you do? If you do very obscure subject matter and they're painfully slow moving, nobody cares. You've got to make those films that attract an audience so you have a scale of success. Because Tarantino says that I've studied careers, and the really smart filmmakers know how to do a career. And your first film gets you your second film, okay? Sometimes the first film was the breakthrough, like Soderbergh's film was Sex, Lies, and Videotapes, and his second film was Kafka, which I frankly don't think is that good. But Quentin's first film was Reservoir Dogs, which he did for $1 million. And it was really interesting because he figured Pulp Fiction was going to gross about $30 million. He compared it to a Wayans Brothers film called Mo Money, which had grossed about $30 million, and said, I want to do Mo Money business, okay? And of course, Pulp Fiction grossed like $200 million. And he came into my office afterwards. He said, they've just offered me this film, The Green Hornet, and I could do a really good job on that film. And if Pulp Fiction had grossed $30 million, that's the film I'd be doing next, okay? So he's very aware of how to build a career. You must choose these little films with an eye towards building a career. And the one hallmark of these smaller films is you've got to be able to find an audience. You have to have a vocabulary where people actually don't get bored in the film, okay? We've seen 4 or 5 films, all shot digitally, which I referred to before, and the scenes, I think it was driving Pietro and Daniel crazy. People don't start the scene in the middle. They start the scene where somebody gets out of a car and walks into a room, and they don't end the scenes in the middle. They walk out of the room, and it's like, what the fuck? You have to use a vocabulary to attract people. So you've got to have a set of rules for those films where you're going to get noticed and make a film that has a certain dynamism to it, and then you can build out from that. If you're just making a smaller, more obscure film, you're just not going to get anywhere. So you have to have a showman's hat on as a producer. If you're going to choose a first-time filmmaker, you want to get the film made. And the other thing is, why do independent films succeed? They succeed because of good performances. They don't succeed because of special effects. They don't succeed because there's a lot of shooting. But if you're a director who gets noticed off of a small film, it's because you've gotten good performances. And particularly the way the Academy Awards go now, particularly because Harvey Weinstein's so good at promoting them, there are smaller, lower-budget films, and he gets all the Oscar nominations for the actors, because an actor will cut their price and work for $100,000 or $50,000 to do a great role. So when you're developing these scripts, you want those great roles for actors, and the director who breaks out of a small film, it's because they get offered the big films because actors want to work with them. And that's just the key. So if you study the business equation of smaller films and why they succeed because the performances are good. They succeed because there's a story that draws you in, and they can succeed because they're edited with a way to just entertain the audience. There are very few films that are slow-moving for which you have patience, in my opinion. I have patience for a Malick film. I had patience for Sofia Coppola's film Somewhere, which I found to be slow, because I knew that it was a very deliberate film. But for everybody else, you just want to tell a story, because one of the epiphanies I have often is we sit in these offices, we're basically telling stories. You have to have a belief that the humans have an innate need for story. We have an innate need for a story with a theme and a closure and something. It's just a biological need we have. We tell each other stories, and people see their lives in stories. You know, and that's one of the objections I have to independent films, where at the beginning and at the end nothing has happened, and you've just seen variations on the same emotional theme. We all tell ourselves stories about our lives. This is how I met my wife. This is how I met my boyfriend. Okay, this guy fucked me, or this is how I had this success. We see narrative in our lives. We see, and more deeply to that, I think we attach meaning to the narrative in our lives. So when we go into a cinema and we see this large image that's working on every level, we want to be entertained by a certain narrative drive to it. And drive is what I'm talking about. Narrative can be incomplete, but if you feel you're seeing the same scene over and over again. So as a producer, we are showmen. If you're not willing to think of the audience and want the audience to embrace your film and tell your friends, you really shouldn't be a producer, in my opinion. You've got to bring that same aesthetic to any of the smaller films. So the reason I think is, in some ways, digital is sort of ruining smaller films because it's created its own aesthetic of a sort of naturalistic performance, as I said before. So I do think there's, look, A Beast of the Southern Wild is clearly a breakout film. There was this film a few years ago, Winter's Bone, that got Jennifer Lawrence an Oscar nomination. It's just, you've got to approach an independent film or a smaller budget film with the same enthusiasm or mindset they approach the Avengers, just a different aesthetic. Now, what's changed is, see, I grew up, and one of the gold standards in film are films of the 70s. If you don't know 70s American films, you're at a disadvantage with directors, because Sidney Lumet was at his heyday. Alan Pakula was making great films, and here's why. In the 70s in America, films about what were happening in the culture were also commercial successes. Even Easy Rider, which was a breakthrough film, which was about the cultural change at the time. So, you know, or Serpico or Network are those great films. Those films were about the culture today. And they were hits. Now those films aren't hits and they're harder to get financed anymore. Part of the reason is that American television is really good. American television allows you over a season of 20 episodes to get so deeply invested in a character and in a world, and thematically they're borrowing from what's going on. Television has usurped what films used to do. So the marketplace has shifted less away from films about the times we live in and a certain kind of social realism. So independent films tend to do less and less than that. And again, I just think you've got to look back. Does anybody want to see your film? That's the first thing you have to ask yourself as a producer. Who wants to see my film? And every film I thought there would be a big audience for, and you know, I've been wrong, you know, half the time and right half the time. But if I don't think anybody wants to see the film, so no matter what scale you're working on, you kind of have to have that. And you can find real gems out there, you know, and they're really good. The new David O. Russell film, Silver Linings Playbook, is great. I hear the Ben Affleck film is great. But you're not finding as many in the mainstream. You have to sort of find them more. I hope that in a rambling way answers your question.
There's
yeah.
one more. Two or three more questions. We have time, and then
good.
it's
Thank
like
you.
the lunch
Okay.
break. Maybe.
If I can just add
Sure.
something to
Yeah,
this
please,
question. You were talking a lot about younger filmmakers, but I was wondering about the established filmmakers like Andrew Nichols or Spielberg. I mean, my feeling is that I miss something at their films right now. I mean, Gattaca, for my feeling, has more kind of a heart than in time. And yeah, my question was more, if you have a explanation why this changes, or if you don't feel like this.
Well, because I'm being recorded, I can't be as candid as I would normally be. I'd rather go the other way and talk about my friend Soderbergh, with whom I've been lucky enough to do 3 films. Steven works in every genre, okay, in every type of films, and I'm a big guy. Spielberg's a great director. I don't think anybody's ever moved the camera as well in the history of cinema as Spielberg, or like Eastwood. These guys deserve to do anything they want. They've given us so much, okay, they have a failure, who cares? Now, the heart of your question is, why shouldn't they take more chances in a way? Why should they just do more conventional stuff? I honestly can't speak to that. But other filmmakers, look, say what you will about Oliver. Oliver Stone always sort of takes chances on his films. I remember Altman saying years ago, you know, he works at a budget level, they just let him do anything he wants. And his films were terribly hit and miss. So part of it is, there's one rule. I'm fascinated by how you sustain a career in Hollywood, because we see people come and flame out. And the key to success and longevity in Hollywood is reinvention. You have to want to keep reinventing and challenging yourself. When you're making the same film over and over again, you will become stale. And in the filmmakers you've mentioned, to the degree they're disappointing you because they're making the same film over and over again. And the great thing about Eastwood is he fails, but he's always doing something different. And then he'll do a film as great as Unforgiven, okay, or $1 Million Baby, for which he's won Oscars. He'll just keep going and trying different stuff. You know, the thing about Woody Allen is I think he's become a little conservative. There are other filmmakers, and somebody will see this and I'll probably get, you know, challenged for it. I find Wes Anderson is a masterful filmmaker, but he's making the same film over and over again, okay? And I know people love his work, okay? So I think you have to keep challenging yourself, and that's the essence of some of the disappointment you might feel from these filmmakers. They're just not taking chances, and the frustration is they're established enough to do anything they want. But you know, Spielberg's got a lot more great films in him, and I actually consider Gattaca Andrew's best film because we produced it. So.
Oh, I think as well.
So is there one last question, I would say?
Hi, I want you to ask about your work with screenwriters. How
Yes.
do you work closely to them, and what do you do when you like the story and the screenwriter likes the story, and then in the cutting room they say, oh yeah, let's change the dramaturgy?
Well, I have two parts to that, two answers to that. It's a good question, because I have another rule of producing, which is you must work from a shared vision outward, okay? You shouldn't hire a screenwriter with whom you disagree. You shouldn't hire a director with whom you disagree. Everybody should be sharing the same vision of the film and working to make it better from your own perspective. So that's a central idea. When you have a screenplay, you agree with the idea, you're just making suggestions to make it better. When the director comes on board, you agree on the idea. Your suggestions are in service of what the film you've agreed to make is, and not all producers, I think, operate that way. Like, you get in the editing room, you've changed it. I don't know what to say. It's like Pietro told the story about how Kevin Costner was disappointed in the great monologue in the middle that Donald Sutherland gives, because Costner's giving this speech about the conspiracy against JFK, and he was disappointed that lines were missing from it. And if you saw Pietro's class, the scene's just masterful, okay? And I know that an actor is always going to come and see a film and be disappointed that something they loved has been taken out. And but you try and massage them and convince them that it's okay. Or sometimes you put it back in and maybe it works and maybe it doesn't work. I would never say no. Now the same applies with the screenwriter, okay? Some stuff just doesn't work. And then the audience is telling you. I would say this, I don't know how much they do in Europe as much, but we do a lot of test screenings. And the test screenings, they're both qualitative and quantitative. The quantitative is you fill out a thing, you think film was excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor. And they do the distinction between good and very good because they discount the goods, and they like to have them be more excellent than very good. And if a film's more very good than excellent, you ask the audience, why didn't you rate it better and stuff. What I like to do is for qualitative stuff, which is we screened Contagion, and we found that the audience really understood the film, and the scores it got was 68%, which is really poor, okay? And on his film Traffic, it got a 68%, okay? And they were both hits, because in the theater, the audience, liked the film and appreciated it. They paid for it. The thing about comedies is they laugh or they don't. If they're not laughing, the director can't and the writer can't go, gee, it's great. You go, but they didn't laugh. Now, in a drama or a thriller, it's different. Then it becomes more subjective. So I would never be insulting of it, but at some point, everybody just has to agree what works. And if the director disagrees, then I apologize, but in advance. But the things that the writer may hold on to stuff that just isn't working in the film, just like the actor will hold on to something that isn't working in the film. So at the end of the day, the audience is telling you, really. That's it. Thank you.